And we'll give just a minute for folks to get logged on and get settled in before we get started. For those of you who I haven't met before, my name's Jillian Hawkins. I'm the Assistant Executive Director here at the Illinois Democratic County Chairs Association. And thank you for joining us on this beautiful Monday to learn about campaign finance. If you are new to our virtual training series, I'm just going to go over how tonight's going to work. Everybody will remain muted during the training, but the chat box is open. So if you have any questions, please be sure to put all of your questions in the chat box, and we'll have some time to go over those at the end of the presentation. Please remember to be respectful of your fellow trainees as well. We've got a lot of different ranges of experience here on the call tonight. There's no stupid questions. Ask any questions you may have, because we're here to learn. Give just a little bit, because I know some people just jumped on, so we'll just give them some time to get settled here. Our training is going to last just about an hour, so please try to remain present on the training. If you need a glass of water, go ahead and get that now, but we'll try to be respectful of everyone's time and keep it to an hour or less. Just admitting a couple more folks here, and then we'll get started. While we're waiting for everybody to get on, just so that we can get to know each other, in the chat box, if you could just put who you are, what county you live in, and your role with the party, if you're a candidate, if you're a chair, if you're a volunteer, if you're a precinct committee person, just so we can start to get to know each other. Okay, so I will go ahead and get us started. Today we are joined by Ed Mullen. Ed is an experienced litigator who has represented clients from individuals and small businesses to Fortune 100 companies. He's handled lawsuits from pre-suit investigation through trial and appeal in a broad range of substantive areas. And he also advises nonprofits and political organizations on formation and legal governance issues. He's here tonight to talk to us about campaign finance in Illinois. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Ed.
Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I was just saying it's 79 degrees and sunny for a change in Chicago. So I thank you for taking your evening and joining us to talk about one of the most exciting and thrilling parts of election law, which is campaign finance. And while it may not be the most exciting thing, it is very, very important that you do it correctly. Because if you don't, you could wind up with fines, and there is also a ballot forfeiture act that could potentially impact your ability to be on the ballot. So campaign finance rules and campaign finance reporting are both very important, and I'm glad you've joined us tonight. No matter what I did, I probably couldn't, as long as we sat here tonight, teach you everything there is to teach you about campaign finance law. It is something that is ongoing, so you're going to constantly have to be going back to the Illinois State Board of Elections website, which has a wealth of information on campaign finance reporting. It's got information on donations and expenditures and reports filed by candidates. It's got forms that you're going to need to use. So it's very important that you take a look at the Illinois Board of Elections website and get yourself familiar with that website. It has a campaign finance guide, which is a 50 or so page guide to campaign finance for candidates and treasurers. It has a disclosure calendar that reminds you when your filings are due. It has a document that contains all of the statutes and regulations on campaign finance, which is honestly very complicated and difficult to read. And by the time you get to that space, you might be wanting to give an attorney a call or give the board a call for assistance if you get to the point where you need to go to the statutes and regulations themselves to answer a question. It has the current contribution limits, which get adjusted occasionally for cost of living and were adjusted recently. It has the forms you're going to use, such as a statement of organization, which is what you use to file your campaign committee, an in-kind contribution form for people who give your committee in-kind contributions, and other forms that we're going to talk about. In addition, it has a link to the official reporting site of the State Board of Elections. So if you're filing your reports with the State Board of Elections electronically, you're going to need to do that through the IDIS, which there's a link to on the elections website. So I do recommend that you get used to the campaign disclosure section of that website if you're going to be a candidate, if you're going to be a treasurer, just if you're interested in finding out what committees are doing and who's giving money and who's spending money and how they're spending it, that you take a look at that. So the first thing I want to talk about is forming a committee. In Illinois, any person who is running for office and raising and spending money for office is governed by basically the same laws in Article 9 of the Illinois Election Code. So if you're running for township trustee or you're running for the governor of Illinois, you're pretty much following the same election law rules. The committee is formed by filing what we call a statement of organization, or what's known in short as a D1, with the Illinois State Board of Elections. You have to file that document within 10 days of raising and or spending $5,000 in a 12-month period. What you find, though, is a lot of people, and this is perfectly acceptable, file their statement of organization before they've raised $5,000. So they've raised no money, they've raised $1,000, and it's perfectly fine to do that. But once you raise $5,000 in a 12-month period, then you're required to file this document within 10 business days with the State Board of Elections. Part of the reason that people file it early is because they want to announce their candidacy. They want to use their statement of organization form in order to open a bank account for the committee. They want to show Act Blue or some other credit card processing company that they exist in order to process credit card donations. So there are a lot of reasons to go ahead and file that statement of organization before you raise the $5,000, but you're not required to until you raise the $5,000. The first thing when you form the committee that you want to think about is what type of a committee you are. Most people who are on these calls are candidate committees, and they're people who are running for office and they open a committee to support their candidacy for office. There are also party committees that are official entities of the party. For instance, Democratic Party of Illinois has a political action committee. A lot of county organizations have political action committees, et cetera. Then there's just a general political designation, which is for, let's say the Sierra Club has a political action committee, or Planned Parenthood has a political action committee. Those are political committees. There are independent expenditure committees, which on the federal level are commonly known as super PACs. And those are committees that can take unlimited contributions, but when they spend their money, they can't coordinate with the candidates. They have to spend their money independently and can't coordinate how they spend the money, what they spend the money on, what the messaging is with the candidate committee. And then you have a ballot initiative committee, which is set up to support ballot initiatives such as the fair tax amendment that was on the ballot last election cycle. And those also have unlimited contributions, but they can't transfer money to other types of committees. So first thing to understand is what committee type you have, because there are going to be somewhat different rules for each of the committees. But what I'm going to focus on tonight is the candidate committee, and most of those rules are going to be applicable to all of the committees, and whether or not I'll try to make a difference. Once you file your statement of organization, anytime there's a change in the information that's on the statement of organization, you need to amend that within 10 business days. You cannot spend money from the committee if you do not have a chair or a treasurer. So on your statement of organization, you're going to identify someone who's going to be a chair of the committee, and you're going going to identify someone who's going to be the treasurer of the committee. If that person resigns or withdraws from being the chair or the treasurer, you need to amend your statement of organization. And if you don't have a chair or a treasurer, you can't actually spend money. One thing that I recommend to some of my candidates between election cycles, sometimes people forget about all of the requirements that they have for reporting because they're not raising money, they're not spending money if they've got 4 years between their elections. So think about whether or not it makes sense to close your committee in between the election cycles if you're not really raising or spending money during that period, and that'll avoid any problems with forgetting to report things that you're supposed to report and getting fined. So when you file the statement of organization, it's a pretty simple 2-page form, and it's gonna ask you for a lot of information. You need to come up with a committee name. If you're running as a candidate, it needs to include your name in the name of the committee. If you are a candidate that's running for multiple offices, you've got to put the name of the office that relates to the committee that you're forming. So if you're running for ward committee person in Chicago and you're also running for state representative and you have a committee that's set up to handle both of those elections, then you've got to have the name of the candidate and the name of the office and the name of the committee. The only other thing I tell my clients about this is when you are fundraising and people are writing the name of the committee on the check, think about how long the name of the committee is, because some people put like committee to elect Kathleen Kennedy Sullivan for Cook County Circuit Court Judge. You don't want people having to write that down on a check on a regular basis. So just think about that. You need to put the address, phone number, and email of the committee, and you can choose to get email notifications, which I recommend. But you want to make sure that the address and phone number and email are something that someone's going to check. So if you set up a PO box for your campaign and you use the PO box for notifications, and then at some point you get rid of the PO box and you forget to change it, you could be getting notifications. You could be being told you have to come in for a hearing. You could be told you've been fined, and you not get that information because you haven't changed the address. So make sure that you're using an address and a phone number and email that you're going to be able to be contacted at. The statement of organization is going to ask for the date of creation. If you have not raised $5,000 yet, it's going to be the day that you file it. If you have raised $5,000, it's going to be the day that you raise $5,000. If you have over $5,000 in your account, the amount of cash available when you started is the amount of cash that you had before you hit $5,000. So if you have $2,500 in your account and someone gives you $2,500, you've now got $5,000 and have to file the form. But you don't put that you have $5,000 on hand, you put that you have $2,500 on hand, because that was the amount that you had before you had $5,000. That confuses a lot of people. The statement of organization is going to ask what the purpose is, and that's generally just to elect the candidate to the office that they're running for. It's going to ask for the candidate's address and what office they're seeking. You're going to need to identify a chair and a treasurer. If you have a custodian of records, for instance, you've hired someone to do your compliance work, you might want to list them, but that's optional. The treasurer is really important because that person has the legal obligation to make sure that you're filing all of your reports on a timely basis and correctly. And while that person doesn't need to be the person who actually files the report, they are the ones who are responsible for making sure that it gets done. So think very carefully when choosing your treasurer to make sure that it's someone responsible and someone that's not going to walk away from the obligation halfway through the campaign. The chair generally doesn't have a huge amount of duties or even authority with the campaign, but you need to have a chair of the committee. You need to identify a bank, and this is actually a little more complicated than it seems, because you have to identify the bank before you filed the statement of organization, and most banks are not going to open an account for you until you file the statement of organization. So you should go to whatever bank you're thinking of using, tell them that you're filing a political committee statement of organization and that you want to open a bank account with them, because a lot of banks are going to tell you no, they don't like these accounts, and you might have to go to 2 or 3 different banks before you're going to find one that opens one for you. So you want to make sure that the bank that you put on your statement of organization is actually going to let you open an account, or else you're going to have to go back and amend that almost immediately. There is also a place to put what you're going to do with any funds that are left over when the committee terminates. And you have 3 options. One is to return the money to all of your donors in the percentage that they gave you money. So let's say you raised $100,000 and you have $100 left. You don't want to divide up $100 between all the people that gave you $100,000. It's just logistically difficult and impractical. So I very rarely recommend that people do that. The second option is to transfer it to another political committee, which is fine. The third option is what I generally recommend that most clients do, is you give it to a nonprofit organization. Try to pick a nonprofit organization that is well known in the district that you're running in. And you can always amend that down the road if you change your mind about what you want to do. That's your statement of organization, and you're going to file that with the State Board of Elections. It needs to be signed and dated, and you can file it with the board by email, you can file it by mail, or you can file it by fax. And then once you file that, you are opening your account, and it is public information. So as soon as you file this with the board, it is going to go up on the State Board of Elections website, and people are going to know that you're running. So you need to be prepared that your candidacy is going to be public, if it wasn't already, when you file this document. And the last piece of advice on the D1 is that once you file the D1, the State Board of Elections is going to stamp it in the upper right-hand side that it was filed and when it was filed, and they're going to give you a political committee ID number. And that is the document that you're going to need to take with you to the bank to open your bank account. You can't just give them the one that doesn't have the stamp on it that you filed. So you need to go to the Board of Elections website. You need to look up under a committee search your own committee and print out your own D1 with the file stamp and with the date and with the committee number in order to open up your bank account. And so that is what you do to become a committee. And once you become a committee, there are a lot of rules and regulations that apply to you. And the first thing I want to talk about is contribution limits. And this depends on the type of the committee. So if you're a ballot initiative or independent expenditure committee, you have no limits, but all of the other committees do. And also be aware that the limits change. So you should be checking with the State Board of Elections website to see if it's been adjusted upward because of cost of living before you decide what checks you're going to return or what you're going to ask people for. So right now, the limit for an individual is $6,000, and that's per person. So a married couple, for instance, each of them can give you $6,000. There's no limit for family members, and that's defined as your spouse, your parent, and your child. So, your great aunt 3 times removed is not a relative. Your cousin, your uncles, they're not relatives. Or they're not family members according to the election code, so they have the limits. It's only your spouse, your parent, and your child that don't. If you give yourself more than $100,000, and that includes you and your family members as it's defined in the code, if you give yourself more than $100,000, you become a self-funding candidate. Once you become a self-funding candidate, you have 24 hours to file a notification with the Board of Elections saying that you are a self-funding candidate. And once you do that, the contribution limits on all of the candidates in that race are eliminated. So if you become a self-funding candidate, you have no contribution limit that apply to you as a candidate, and any other candidate that's running in your race also does not have a limit. The contribution limit is per cycle is a question, and that's like 2 bullet points down that we'll get to. A corporation or labor organization has a limit of $12,000, but most corporations and labor organizations that are regularly donors to political candidates will set up a political action committee so that they'll have a political action committee limit as opposed to the corporation or labor organization limit. And the political action committee limit is $59,900, significantly higher. And these limits are per cycle, and the cycle is different for different types of candidates. So let's say you're a state representative and you're running in a primary and then you're running in a general election every 2 years. The cycle begins on January 1 following the general election, and it goes to the day after the primary. And then it goes from the day after the primary to December 31st of the general election. And so each of those is a cycle. So for a political committee, political action committee, it's a calendar year. And so for ballot initiative committee, independent expenditure, it's a calendar year. So you need to look at the race that you're running to make sure that you're using the right cycle. On the federal level, a lot of people know that you can raise money for the general election during the primary and designate it as a contribution for the general election. You can't do that under state law. So you can only raise primary money during the primary and general money during the general election. Okay, so now I want to talk about some other fundraising rules in addition to the contribution limits. So anonymous donations are prohibited. So there needs to be the name of a person attached to every donation. Donations in the name of another person are prohibited. So, I can't make a donation in the name of Donald Trump to Jan Schakowsky. That would be prohibited. It has to be in my own name. Public funds cannot be used for campaign purposes, and that is interpreted broadly. So it's not just cash. You can't use public buildings, you can't use a public car, you can't use a public cell phone. So you need to think carefully about making sure that you don't use any public property for your campaign purposes. Foreign nationals and corporations may not contribute to campaigns. So if someone is a US citizen or someone has a green card, they are allowed to contribute to your campaign. What you'll see on organizations like Act Blue is when someone donates, they say at the bottom of the page, I'm 18 years of age, this is my own money, and I am a US citizen or a green card holder. So some electronic services will check that for you. If not, I think a lot of people are familiar with going to fundraisers where you go and you write down your name and your address, and sometimes it asks for your employer and your occupation, and then it asks some questions, are you 18 years of age? Are you giving this money voluntarily of your own? Is it your own money? And are you a US citizen? So those are, it's a good idea to if you're having people give you information along with handing you a check to have on whatever form they're filling out or whatever envelope they're filling out, that they meet these requirements. So publicly chartered banks and businesses cannot contribute to campaigns. You can't commingle campaign and personal funds, so you should always get a separate account for your campaign, a separate EIN number, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. You cannot solicit or receive campaign contributions on state property. If you are running for a statewide constitutional office or for the General Assembly, you cannot have a fundraiser or fundraise in Sangamon County while the legislature is in session. If you are running for judge, there are additional rules that you should look at the canons and make sure that you're complying with, but judges are not allowed to directly ask people for money themselves. They have to have people ask for campaign contributions for them. There are some other rules that apply specifically to judges that you should take a look at if you're running in a judicial race. Raffles that people pay to enter are illegal in Illinois unless you have a license. I've helped several candidates get licenses over the years, and the amount of work that goes into a license relative to the amount of money that is usually made from a raffle means that I don't do that anymore because it's just not worth it. But it is possible if you want to do that. So in addition to those rules, there are some disclosure rules on any communications that come from the campaign. So when you're running a campaign, you're going to have advertisements, you're going to have email, you're going to have all types of ways that you're communicating with the general public, with your supporters, with your donors, etc. Every type of communication that goes out from your campaign needs to say on it, paid for by Committee X. So paid for by the name of the committee. You're going to see a lot of people use some other words that come out of the Federal Elections Commission, paid for by and authorized by, and other wording. But all it needs to say in Illinois is paid for by the name of the committee. In any communication where you're asking for money, you have to use this quoted language in addition to the paid for by language. So anything that is an invitation to a fundraiser, the donate page on your website, an email solicitation that goes out, anything where you are asking for money, it needs to say a copy of our report and the entire sentence that is quoted here. And you're going to find that everywhere. You're going to find that really easy to locate because every candidate has this on every fundraising communication, or they should. So it's really easy to find this language. In addition to the election code rules, there's an IRS code rule that says campaigns that raise more than $100,000 in a year have to say that contributions to the committee are not tax deductible. For bigger campaigns, I generally tell my candidates to start putting that disclosure on at the beginning of the year, you know, whether they raise 100,000 or not, because they're going to forget to do it once they hit the $100,000 threshold. So it's easier to put it in there as a preventative measure than to forget to do it later in the year. Just one other thing, there's an exception for the paid for by on small items. So if you print out pens or a nail file with the campaign logo on it, you don't have to do that. But be careful on Facebook because there were some issues a couple elections ago about insufficient disclosures on Facebook that a couple candidates got in trouble for. So make sure that if you've got an ad on Facebook or you've got a fundraising link on Facebook, that you've got this language somewhere that, you know, it doesn't necessarily need to be in the piece of the feed that people see, but once they click onto it, it should be somewhere within that message. So those are the rules, and in addition to the rules, you've got reporting requirements, and there are three main reports that campaigns or political committees have to file. The one that everyone has to file is the quarterly reports, and those are commonly known as D2s, and we're going to talk in a little bit of depth about the quarterly reports. There's also two reports called the A1 and the B1, and we're going to talk about those separately as well. We're going to start with the quarterly report. And this is due the 15th day after the end of a quarter. If the 15th day is on a Saturday or Sunday, it's due on Monday. But it's very important that you get this done on time because it's due at midnight. If you file it at 12:01, you can be fined for filing it late. Every day that you file it late, the fine increases. So you need to get that done as quickly as possible. You need to file your D1, or sorry, your D2, even if the committee does not raise or spend any money in a quarter. So if you put 0 for every entry, you still have to file your report. The report is made up of 4 general sections. You've got receipts, expenditures, debts and obligations, and the cash balance. We're going to go into some detail on the receipts and expenditures next. Debts and obligations, a lot of people ask whether that's, you know, if I haven't paid an electric bill, or I owe an independent contractor for something. That's not really what goes in debts and obligations. It's loans and long-term obligations that the committee has. And then the cash balance is simply looking at the amount that you had at the beginning of the quarter, how much did you raise, how much did you spend, and how much is left. What you want to do with the cash balance, though, is you want to make sure that that is the same as your actual cash balance. And it may not be the same on the day that you file the report, because some checks may have cleared, some checks may not have cleared. You may be waiting for money to come in from ActBlue and be deposited in your bank, but you had to report it on the day that you were notified, so you've already reported it. So it doesn't need to be exact that the balance is going to match up with the cash balance. The balance in your bank account is going to match up with the cash balance on your report, because the accounting on this is not perfect. But if you're off, you want to understand why you're off and make sure that you're not off because you've made a mistake, or that you've forgotten to report an expenditure, you've forgotten to report a check, you put in a check. It was for $250, but you put it in for $2,500, and that explains why you're off by $1,000 or $2,000. You don't need to be exact, but you want to understand why you're off, because you don't want it to sit there and then 3 months later you're off a little more, and then 3 months later you're off even further. And then I've literally had people call me, and we've had to go back 3 or 4 years and amend to make things correct and make the cash balance match the actual balance. So just be careful to do that as you go along, so that you're not way off at some point in the future. So talking specifically about the receipts on the D2, you need to itemize receipts if you get receipts from a single contributor of over $150 in a quarter. So that means if I give you $50 in January and $200 in March, that's $250 in the quarter, and you have to itemize those together. If I give you $50 in March and $200 in, well, let's say I give you $50 in March and $125 in April, you don't need to itemize that because that's in 2 separate quarters. So it needs to be over $100 in a single quarter. And if you itemize it, you're going to need the name, the address, the date of the contribution, and the amount of the contribution. And IDIS, which I mentioned before, is the electronic filing system. One of the good things about using the electronic filing system, even if you are not required to, is that it's going to add that up for you. So if you put in that Joe Smith gave you $50 in January, and then you go back in and input that he gave you $120 in March, the system's going to add those for you so that you know that you have to itemize that individual, and that makes it a little bit easier for you. If someone gives you over $500 in a quarter, you also need to put down their employer and their occupation, and you need to make your best efforts to find that information. The date of the receipt depends on the type of the contribution, and in a little bit I'm going to show you a chart that's in the campaign finance guide that shows different types of contributions and when they're received. But just as an example, if I get a check from someone, it is received when I put it in the bank. So I can carry that check around in my wallet for 2 weeks and deposit it 2 weeks after the check was handed to me, and the date of receipt is considered the date that I put it in the bank. If someone hands me cash, it depends on whether I put it in the bank or not. If someone hands me cash and I turn around and I hand it to someone else to pay for an expenditure, then it's received on the day that I received it. If I put it in the bank, it's received on the day that I put it in the bank. So you need to understand when the different types of contributions are received. And when we go to the website, I'm going to show you a little bit around the website in a minute, and I'll show you the chart that shows that information. A contribution is defined in the code as anything of value, and it's really easy to think about cash money as something of value. But in addition to cash, people will give you goods and services that are considered in-kind contributions. So for example, let's say instead of someone handing you $100 so that you can go to Office Depot and get some pens and some clipboards for your petitions, they go to Office Depot for you. They buy clipboards, they buy pens, and they buy some other stuff, and they bring that to the campaign office and donate the goods. Then that's an in-kind contribution, and you need to report the monetary value of that contribution. There's also in-kind services, and you don't want to confuse in-kind services with volunteer work, because just having someone come and knock on doors or stuff envelopes or do the regular types of things that volunteers do is not considered an in-kind contribution. It's generally something that someone would otherwise be paid for. So for instance, let's say you have a CPA who you get to be your treasurer, and the CPA comes and does accounting work for you, then that would be considered an in-kind contribution and not just volunteer work, because that's something they otherwise get paid for. When you do get in-kind contributions, and we're going to talk about this again a little bit later, the person who gives you the contribution is supposed to estimate or give you the actual value of the contribution. But if they don't, you still have an obligation to report it, and you still have an obligation to estimate do a fair market value estimate of the goods and the services. So one of the other items under receipts is going to be a transfer in. And this is money, but it differs from a contribution in that it is from another political action committee. So let's say, for instance, I call Governor Pritzker and I ask him to give $5,000 to my campaign, and he writes a check from his personal bank account to my campaign. Then that's a contribution, and I would report it as a contribution. If he takes a check from his gubernatorial campaign committee and writes a check from the campaign committee to my campaign committee, then that's a transfer in. And so the transfer ins to my committee are theoretically supposed to match all the transfers out from the committees that donated to me. So that's the difference between a transfer in and a contribution. There's also an item for other receipts, and this is really miscellaneous stuff that doesn't fit in the rest of the categories. And some of the things that have come up that are other receipts are interest on an interest-bearing account, sales of merchandise from the campaign. I've had campaigns that would rent an office and then have other campaigns sublet from them, and that would be other receipts. So just stuff that doesn't really fit into the other categories. And then finally, you have loans. And typically, there are a lot of rules that relate to loans, but typically the loans are going to come from the candidate or the candidate's family. And there was a question here about the contributions about transfers in, and those are that's the limit that relates to political action committees. So that's going to be the 59,900 limit for the most part. The only time that's different is if it's a party committee, but if you have a political committee or a candidate committee doing a transfer in, that's the 59,900 limit. And as for loans, generally, if you've got, if you're going to use a bank loan or you're going to use a loan from someone that's not related to you, you want to make sure all your I's are dotted and T's are crossed, and you want to call someone and just make sure you're following all the rules, because that's too complicated to get into here. But most of the time, the loan's going to be from the candidate or from the candidate's family. And you should try to make sure that if you're going to identify something as a loan as opposed to a contribution, that you do that when you first file, and you don't change something that the candidate has given, or try to change something that the candidate has given from a contribution to a loan after you've already filed it, because that's not a good thing to do. Okay, so that's receipts, and then money coming in, and then we're going to talk about money going out, which is very similar, expenditures. If you have expenditures over $150 in a quarter, you're going to itemize those. You'll see on a lot of people's reports that you get like 7-Eleven because they go to 7-Eleven and they get soda or stuff for volunteers. And so they've got a $10 charge and a $12 charge and a $17 charge. But once that hits 150, you've got to itemize each of the individual expenditures. There is a list of prohibited expenditures that I'm going to show you, but basically you want to make sure that the money that you are spending from your campaign account is related to the effort to get yourself elected. And recently the code was amended to make it clear that childcare expenses are allowed. There was a previous informal opinion that they were allowed, but it's now in statute. One of the places in reporting expenditures where people tend to make mistakes is with ActBlue or other credit card processing companies. So what happens with ActBlue is someone writes you or someone gives you $100 through their credit card, and ActBlue will send you a check for $96. They won't send you a check for $100. They'll keep a credit processing fee. And that is a contribution of $100 and an expenditure of $4 to ActBlue. So you're not reporting that as a $96 contribution, you're reporting that as a $100 contribution, and then each individual ActBlue expenditure is reported as an expenditure. And you want to be careful if the donation is for $1,000 and you get a check for $995, you want to make sure that you understand that that's a $1,000 check. And you'll understand the reason for that when we get to reporting A1s, but you just understand that the contribution is the whole amount, not the whole amount minus the processing fee. And then in expenditures, you've got transfers out, and loans, which are really just the same as in receipts in reverse, and not really much to say about those. So those are your receipts and your expenditures. So your D2 is made up of, as I said, receipts, expenditures, debts and obligations, and your cash balance. And we're going to move on to another type of report, but when I get to I'm going to take you through the board website a little bit. And when we get to that, I'm going to show you one of the reports just so you kind of get a visualization of how this all looks if you haven't seen it all before. So the second main type of report that you have to file is what's known as an A1. And this is something that you file if you get a $1,000 contribution in a single day from a single source. And this includes money from the candidate and their family members. It also includes loans, and it includes in-kind contributions. $1,000 needs to be reported within 5 business days. And this is a very simple report. You just put the name, the date, and the amount of the contribution and the address, and you report that electronically or to the board, however you're reporting, within 5 business days. This is a place where a lot of people make mistakes and get fined. When you get to 30 days before an election in which you're participating, so if you are running in a primary election, 30 days before the primary election, you have to file your A1s within 2 business days. If there's, say you're a state representative and there's a municipal election, that doesn't mean that you have to file your A1s within 2 business days. It's only an election that you're participating in. But this is another place where a lot of people get fined. All right, so I got another question here. Give me a second. So each expenditure to ActBlue needs to be reported separately. And you're going to look through, you know, there are some candidates that have 3-4 full pages of reporting to ActBlue. You can't just put one ActBlue payment for $200. You've got to itemize it because you're going to have different dates for each of them as well. So there's some other reporting issues I wanted to talk about. There's a Form B1, and this is similar to the A1, but it's for independent expenditures. So if you do an independent expenditure for another candidate or for another committee, that's over $1,000, you need to file a B1 within 5 business days or within 2 business days when you're 30 days out from an election. Independent expenditures are expenditures made on behalf of a committee that are not coordinated with the committee. And while most people think independent expenditure committees come from independent expenditures come from independent expenditure committees, they do. But other committees can also make independent expenditures. But most candidate committees are not going to do independent expenditure committees and don't really need to worry about this. As I mentioned a couple times, there's an online reporting system called IDIS. And if you reach a $10,000 balance in any quarter, you are required to use IDIS to file your report. Once you file a report with IDIS, even if you get below that $10,000 balance, you have to continue filing electronically. If you never hit the $10,000 balance, you don't have to file electronically. That being said, the electronic filing makes your life significantly easier in a lot of ways, and it does a lot of work for you, and it prevents you from making a lot of mistakes. So I always recommend that people file electronically, even if they haven't hit the $10,000 balance. I talked earlier about the in-kind notification forms, and these are forms that you want the person who gives you an in-kind contribution to give to you. But those people are generally not subject to regulation by the State Board of Elections. If someone's just a volunteer or someone is a donor to your campaign, they're not required to follow these rules. It's you that's required to follow these rules. So what I recommend to my clients is they make sure that anyone who gives you an in-kind contribution gets a notification form from the campaign and a request that they return it within 5 business days, and then, you know, a follow-up call if you don't get it to ask them to return it. And if you don't get it back from them, again, you have to do a good faith effort to estimate what the value of that in-kind is, and not just say that you're not reporting it because you didn't get the notification form back. So there is enforcement of all of these rules. One way of enforcement is sua sponte by the State Board of Elections. And this is primarily, although not exclusively, for late filings. So if you file your D2 late, the board's going to notice that it's late and they're going to send you a letter issuing a fine, and you'll have the right to try to appeal it or pay it. But the board will issue that fine for late A1s. The board doesn't necessarily know if you have a website that doesn't say paid for by. The board doesn't necessarily know if you send out a fundraising invitation that doesn't include all the language that's supposed to be included. So the public, including your opponent and people that support your opponent, can file what's called a D4, and that's a complaint form to alert the Board of Elections of campaign finance violations. And so that's something you can use offensively and something that you need to be aware can be used against you. And generally there's an initial hearing that's closed to the public to determine whether there's probable cause to go forward with it. But if you're on the complaint side, you are really the prosecutor and have to bring forward the complaint. The board is not going to do that for you. So if you get a letter notifying you of a fine from the board, there's a process that you can go through that's kind of outside the scope of what we're talking here to try to get that fine either eliminated or reduced. But typically, ignorance of the rules is not a defense. The first time you make a mistake, they'll say, you know, we're gonna hold this fine, and if you don't make another mistake for a year or 6 months, we're going to waive it. But then as you go on and you continue to make mistakes, the fines are going to increase. And as I said earlier, there's a Ballot Forfeiture Act that says there are circumstances under which you can be kept off the ballot if you have an unresolved fine with the Board of Elections. And don't worry too much about that, because you'll have plenty of notice if that's the case and an opportunity to cure, but just be aware that that's an issue. If you're using the electronic filing system and it's 10:30 at night on the day that it's due, and the power goes down or the internet drops, one time the board will excuse that, but you have to address it immediately. You can't call them 3 weeks later and say, hey, I tried to file it on time and it didn't go through. You have to address it immediately and get it as filed as quickly as you can, and notify the board that you had an electronic problem in filing. And then if you do get a fine, there are times when you can get that reduced with a settlement, and usually that's if you don't have a lot of money in your account, and the fine is a large percentage of the revenue and the balance in your committee account. So I want to talk about some miscellaneous issues, and I'm not going to go into detail on most of these, but these are just kind of things that are out there other than specifically what's in the election code. There are IRS issues. The first one is you need to get an EIN number in order to open a bank account for your committee. Two things that you need to think about specifically for political committees is there is a designation for political organizations, but it's on the second page of organizations. So when you are filling out the form, there's a whole list of organizations like S Corp, partnership, etc. And then at the bottom it says other. You have to hit other and go to the next page to get political organization. So a lot of people kind of miss that. And then it's going to ask you whether or not you're required to file the form 8871. And if you check this off wrong, you get put in a bucket with the IRS that's really hard to get out of and causes you a lot of headache down the road. So you have to file an 8871 only if you are a political committee or an independent expenditure committee in Illinois. So if you're a candidate committee or you're a party committee, you are excused from filing the form 8871. And so you put no. And if you put yes, the IRS is going to continually send you letters asking why you haven't filed it. So make sure you fill that out correctly. If you're a general political action committee, you do have to file that form and make sure you correctly file that, or you're going to get in trouble for not filing the form. There's a form 1120 POL, which is for non-contribution income. And so if I make a donation to a campaign, that donation is not taxed. But if there's merchandise sold or anything that's not a contribution that's income, there's a potential that is taxable. And if you're getting a lot of items in the other receipts section of your D2, you're going to want to check and see if you need to fill out the 1120 POL. And then some political action committees, generally not candidate committees or party committees, also will need to fill out a form 990 depending on the amount of contributions they get. If you're selling things, if you have merchandise, you have to make sure that you register with the Illinois Department of Revenue to pay sales tax. If you are a public employee of either the state or the federal government, you want to make sure that you are following the Hatch Act, which may prevent you from running at all, and the State Officials and Employees Ethics Act, which puts additional obligations on people who are employees of the government in Illinois. If you're going to have employees or independent contractors on your campaign, you need to be thinking about what tax forms you need from them. W-2s for employees, W-9s for independent contractors. You want to make sure that you're getting your independent contractors a form 1099. If they are paid over $600 in a year, they need to get that in January of the following year. You want to make sure, especially if you have a campaign that's over in November and everything shuts down, you want to make sure you're still meeting your obligations with the IRS for your employees. If you have full-time employees that are filling out the W-2, you need to make sure that you're following workers' compensation and unemployment rules with the state of Illinois. You also want to look at whether or not there are specific requirements for your political subdivision. So for instance, if you are running for alderman in the city of Chicago, there's a statement of financial interest that you need to fill out with the Chicago Board of Ethics in order to run. If you are running for office in Cook County, there are different limits for people who have contracts with Cook County. They can only give you, I think it's $750. So beyond what's in the Illinois Election Code, make sure that whatever political subdivision it is that you're running in doesn't impose additional reporting, disclosure, or limits on you. And then finally, we talked a little bit about the judicial ethics, but you want to make sure that if you're running for judge, that you are following those rules. Last thing I want to talk about is best practices. Collect data from contributors. You don't want to be going back to people who have given you money 3 months later and trying to get information from them. Keep good records and receipts for your expenditures, particularly a lot of people get in trouble on election day where they take out a lot of cash to give to people, to be giving to people who are working at the polling places or poll watching, et cetera, and then, have no idea where that all went. Input the campaign finance data regularly. Don't wait until the end of the quarter to do that. Because your A1s are going to be due every 5 days, if you do a weekly check-in on your calendar, say, Friday at 10 a.m., I'm going to make sure that I don't have to file any A1s. You're never going to be late if you do a weekly check-in. Don't wait to the last minute to file your reports. Take care of problems as they arise. A lot of stuff can be resolved relatively easily if you respond to it as soon as you are notified of it or you realize it. If you get a letter from the board and you put it in your drawer and you forget about it and you don't do anything about it, it just gets worse. So take care of problems as they arise. All things being equal, disclosure is preferred to non-disclosure. Yes, you can give gift cards to volunteers. And then, there's that saying, ask for forgiveness, not permission. Don't do that here. Ask for help and not ask for forgiveness after. The board is very good. The numbers here about giving you information. So if you have any questions or any issues, whether it's technical about how to report something or it's about a donation or an expenditure, ask them. They will give you the information, and they prefer you not to get in trouble. And there we go. All right, so we are at 58 minutes, which is where I was planning to stop, but I did want to just take 2 minutes and share the State Board of Elections website. I hope you'll indulge me for just 2 more minutes here. So this is the Illinois State Board of Elections website. You can see it, right? Okay, so we've got the campaign disclosure tab, and you just see how much information is here. It's just like an enormous amount of information. And you need to kind of get yourself familiar with it. But one of the things you can do is do a committee search, and you can look up yourself, you can look up your opponents, you can look up anyone that interests you. So I am going to look at a campaign that I worked on recently because I know they have. Okay, so you're going to get to the committee. You're going to see information about what the committee is, who the treasurer is, who the chair is, and all the different filings that the committee has filed. And so let's just look at the quarterly report from when the election occurred. And what you'll see is this is how the information is presented on the website. So you've got everything that I talked about. The first section was receipts, And you've got individual contributions, and you've got itemized. And if you click itemize, what you'll see is who contributed, the address, the amount, and the date that we talked about. And then if someone gave over, well, I don't see address and occupation on there, but you still have to report that. And then you have a bulk for non-itemized, and then you have transfers in. And so, for instance, the transfers in came from Citizens for Sarah Feigenholtz. So Sarah Feigenholtz transferred money from her campaign account into Eric Reinhardt's. And then you have loans received, you have other receipts, there were none, and that's pretty common. And then the total receipts, then you have in-kind contributions listed. We'll look at what one of those is. So the Lake County Democrats paid $124 for printing. So that was an in-kind contribution. They did some printing for the campaign. And then on the expenditure side, you've got transfers out, loans made, which again are rare. And then you've got expenditures that are itemized, and I'm going to show you the Act Blue. So see how the Act Blue is the entire first page, because that was reported correctly. And then you've got loans to the campaign. Those were from the candidate and his family. And then you see how you had the funds available at the beginning, how much was received, the subtotal, the expenditures, and then funds available. Now this is a negative balance, and it's pretty rare that you're going to have a negative balance, but this was just because Act Blue checks had not been received, but the money had been allocated. So that was it. And then there's the campaign finance guide, which is the short guide that I talked about. It's 56 pages, but a lot of the end pages are forms. But if you go to page 16, you'll see the chart on when things are received. And I don't go through all of that in detail because you're probably not going to remember it all, but you see that it's there. And then I just wanted to point out on page 21, there are 11 items that are specifically prohibited for expenditures. So anything in violation of the law, you don't want to pay in excess of market values. So for instance, if there's someone in the community who I want their support and they sell food, instead of going in and paying $300 for my dinner, I pay $2,000 for my dinner in order to curry favor with them. That's illegal. So you want to look at this list of things that are specifically prohibited, but it's generally, if it's related to the campaign, it's okay. If it's personal, it's not okay. And if it's in the gray area, go to the chart and see where it falls. So I'm going to stop there, I believe. And then I see there's another question in the chat. Yeah. So if a candidate donates $100,000 plus, then funding is off for all candidates. Yes. And so, so if you're running for governor, everyone knows who's running for governor. You put governor on your announcement, et cetera. And so anyone who's giving money for a candidate that's running for governor, their limits are off. And the limits were obviously off in the last race. In a lot of judicial campaigns, something interesting happens because, for instance, in Cook County, there could be 15 judicial vacancies. And so I could announce and I could go on to the State Board of Elections and I could say I'm running for judge in Cook County. But I don't have to if I don't know or haven't decided or could potentially be running for multiple vacancies, put which vacancy I'm running for. So in some cases, if you're in a judicial election, there can be a period of time where the caps are not necessarily off for the whole race because the judge hasn't identified which vacancy they're running for, or they're potentially running for multiple or different vacancies. So once everyone has filed their petitions, it's clear what the limits are off for, but in judicial races, sometimes there's a lag between the caps being lifted in a particular race because they don't know which race the judge that made the donation is actually going to run in. That makes sense.
I want to give some time just for any last minute questions in the chat, but Ed, what's the number one or mistake that you see like new candidates, or like the number one mistake people make that folks should watch out for when it comes to either accepting donations or reporting expenditures or anything like that?
Yeah, I think the number one, well, some mistakes are just mistakes, and they're easily fixable, and you don't get in trouble for them, and you just fix them. To me, the biggest is filing things late, because that is where you're actually going to get fined, and once you get fined, that's public, and sometimes candidates in races will use that against you. So you really don't want to get fined for all sorts of reasons. So to me, filing your quarterly report late, or filing your A1 late is the number one problem, both in terms of frequency and in terms of impact, I think. And generally, where that problem comes up is when people are not following the rules on a consistent, or not following up with what they're supposed to be doing on a consistent basis. They think of campaign finance as something that needs to be done every 3 months around the time that their report is due. And so they wait until July 7th to start doing all of their data for June, May, and April. You should be doing the data entry and doing the information as you're going along, so that you're not stuck with this huge crunch of work at the last minute, and that's when people make mistakes.
And we did have a request for that slide with your contact information, if we could put that back up as we're wrapping up here. I don't see any other questions in the chat, and we are at the hour, so I think we'll wrap up there. There's Ed's contact information if you want to take it down before we log off. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. It's a huge amount of information, but very much appreciated. And thank you all for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again.
Thank you.